Hello, Community Bible Church. It's Pastor Joel, and I am making a special video today and over the next 4 days as well, as we just prepare for this next upcoming sermon on Sunday. And so if you have been coming with us to church this last year, then you know that we've been going through the book of Exodus every single Sunday morning. Now, as Exodus continues on here, you'll notice that as you read through it, the last few chapters are going to be very repetitive, meaning that they're going to almost cover verbatim the previous chapters talking about the tabernacle here. Now, there's a few reasons why the biblical authors would do this. Number one, in that time period, there was no bold typeface. There was no exclamation marks. There wasn't really anything to make something feel important other than to repeat it over and over and over again. And so that is one of the reasons why the biblical authors would repeat it. But then also, and even I think more pertinent in the book of Exodus as well, is this idea that it was very similar to the culture of the day of how other deities, how other gods related to their people, and how the people would write out documents, how they would please their gods. And you see that Moses is still going to use some of those type of parallels in order to show, hey, this is how people relate to their gods. And he's going to use some of those same type of principles in the book of Exodus and other books in the Pentateuch as well here. And so you'll see that just the format, if you were to look at the format of some of these books, it kind of mirrors some of the old legal documents or some of the old religious documents that were common among that day. And so if the Bible was written in the year 2022 and it was written by Americans, then you would see actually that they would probably mirror a lot of the legal documents that we might have today. And so it's just a reflection of the culture that it was a part of here. But because it's so repetitive, and because we've already spent a lot of time talking about it, if I were to go through and just preach through verse by verse on a Sunday, you would probably say, Joel, you literally just said this like 4 weeks ago. Why are you just saying the exact same thing? And so that's why I thought it would be more creative and also a little bit more beneficial to take time during the week and just walk through still these passages, point out a few key things over just a few minutes. But then on Sunday, what we're going to do here is actually look at Exodus, the rest of Exodus 36 all the way through Exodus 39, and just really pull out the key themes that can apply to us today as well. But I still wanted to give you an opportunity, if you've been walking through the book of Exodus, that we're not going to skip over any part of it. We're still going to talk through all of it here just in this video format for the last few chapters here as well. And so we're going to start in Exodus 36 verse 8. Exodus 36 verse 8. You can follow along on the screen or in your Bibles here. And this is where we left off on Sunday here. And we're going to try to finish the rest of chapter 36 today very quickly. And so it says, "And all the craftsmen among the workmen made the tabernacle with 10 curtains. They were made of fine twined linen, blue and purple and scarlet yarn, and cherubim skillfully worked" here. And so it's talking about the craftsmen, that what we talked about on Sunday. And it's saying that all the workmen made the tabernacle with 10 curtains. Now, one thing I'll say right at the start here is we are going to see a significant amount of numbers in these next few chapters here, especially this chapter. And there is this whole study in the Bible called numerology, for which you really study the number, and every single number has a certain meaning and everything like that. Now, I have not gotten fully into that on a Sunday morning, and the reason why is because there's different, the Bible usually doesn't actually tell us what a specific number means. There are a few, I think of 666 talking about the mark of the beast, or 6 is the number of man. There's a few for which the Bible actually says this is what this means. But for the other numbers that it doesn't say, then it's kind of anybody's guess, but you can see certain themes in it. But that means, though, that if you were to go and read a Catholic study Bible, then you would read through it and they would have all sorts of information about every single number meaning a certain thing. But then if you go to a Reformed Protestant Bible or a lecturer, he would say something completely different, all with those same numbers, numbers, but saying, no, this is actually what it means. And then if you go to a charismatic preacher, then he's going to say something completely different by all of those means. So even like the number 4 in studying for this Exodus series, one preacher said that the 4, whenever you see the number 4, you should think of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And whenever you think of those 4 Gospels, you need to be thinking of Jesus. But then there was another preacher who is almost identical as far as what they believe, says, no, whenever you see the number 4, you should think of the 4 corners of the earth. And you should think of the world and mankind. Now that radically changes how we interpret the Bible, right? And so I don't want to venture too far into that when I can't say for sure this is what it means. And so for some of these things, I do believe that symbolically they do mean something, but if the Bible doesn't tell us, then that's something that we're not going to know until we get to heaven here. With that being said, I'll still try and make reference to maybe some symbolism here or there, but just take that with a grain of salt, knowing that some of the numbers is just really anybody's guess. So for instance, whenever you see the number 10, oftentimes people, especially in this tabernacle, what do you think of whenever you think of the number 10? Most people would say, well, the 10 Commandments, the thing that we just talked through, the stories that we just went through there. And so some people are going to argue that, yeah, the 10 curtains was just another picture of the law. And that might be a good one. It doesn't really change anything here. But it says they were made of fine twined linen. Now the linen was white and blue and purple and scarlet yarn. So we have talked about this before, but white usually would represent purity. Blue would be the sky, that the Lord is the Lord of heaven. Purple is the color of royalty, that God is a picture of God as the royal king. And then the scarlet yarn, and we talked about this, you can go look it up, but it's the picture of the blood there. And so that was not a normal color actually in the other tabernacles or the other temples of that day, but they were added in looking forward to the king that was going to die. And then it says the cherubim. Now the cherubim, that's another name for an angel. And typically those are going to be the warrior angels. And so if you remember in Adam and Eve, whenever they sinned in the Garden of Eden, they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and God sent actually 2 cherubim to stand outside with the swords and says, you cannot come in. Now here's the picture now. This is going to be inside the tabernacle right now. And so as you walk inside the tabernacle, you're going to see all sorts of beautiful angels surrounding you, beautiful cherubim. And that was just going to remind you now that these people are guarding the presence. These angels are guarding the very presence of God. So in verse 9, it says the length of each curtain was 28 cubits, and the breadth of each curtain was 4 cubits. All the curtains were the same size. So this is all talking about the inside curtains here. Let me go ahead and throw it up. And if you can see this here, on the inside of the tabernacle, this model has it as blue, but we don't really know what the base color was or anything like that. But you'll see even small little angels woven inside of that. And so it's talking about this inside curtain here. And that was going to be 28 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. And they were all going to be strung up together here. And so once again, people will go crazy and say, well, if you multiply the 4 by the 7, which is God's number, then you're going to get 28. But we really can't say with certainty here exactly what all of those mean here. But in verse 10, it says, he coupled 5 to one another, and 5 and the other 5 curtains he coupled to one another. And so basically, he would make 2 big tarps and then sew the 2 tarps all together to make one large canvas. So it's just going to be one canvas here. Verse 11, it says verse 11, let's see, there we go. He made loops of blue on the edge of the outermost curtain of the first set. Likewise, he made them on the edge of the outermost curtain of the second set. So he is going to make loops. And some of this is just very practical, right? They had to figure out a way to get the curtains to actually hang up on the structure itself. So he's making loops here. In verse 12, he made 50 loops on the one curtain. He made 50 loops on the edge of the curtain that was in the second set. The loops were opposite to one another. So it's just talking about how to make these curtains actually be able to stick up on the structure here. Now, you will notice 50, and that is a pretty significant number in the Bible. We know of a few pretty significant numbers, and 50 definitely is one of them. And so what do you think of when you think of the number 50? If you're an Old Testament saint, you probably would think of the year of Jubilee. So every 50 years, they would actually release all the debt across the country. If you had debt, if you were a slave and you were trying to pay off a debt, because that's what it was, an indentured servitude. If you had a slave and you had you were trying to get out of slavery, if you had a debt and you were trying to pay it back, every 50 years, all of that was released. It was let go. Everybody got a fresh start. Like, how awesome is that? And how could you imagine something like that actually happening here in our culture? No, because our culture is just completely built on debt, unfortunately. But that is what it's made here. And so it's kind of this picture of the coming salvation, because if you were a New Testament believer and you think of 50, then you might think of Pentecost. Penta is 50. It was 50 days after Passover, and that's when the Holy Spirit came. And just like in the year of Jubilee in the Old Testament, there was going to be this kind of fresh start. In the New Testament, when we see 50, Pentecost, we see this fresh start, this new awakening inside of the church there. And so you start to see these small little symbolisms. Once again, don't go too far into it. Don't build a whole theology on it. But I do believe there are probably some symbolisms that can shine forth here. And so in verse 13, and he made 50 clasps of gold, coupled with the curtain, one to the other with clasps, so that the tabernacle was a single whole. And so now they would make these clasps of gold. Now it's so important here. Let me throw up this picture again for us. On the inside, I don't know if you can see it, but on the inside here is all going to be beautiful gold. And if you walk in it, you would see just a massive amount of gold probably all around there, both from the furnitures, from the structures, from everything about there was gold. And that gold obviously is a symbol of expensive, something nice, something beautiful, and this really speaks of God. And so whenever you go inside the tabernacle, you are just going to be confronted with all sorts of wonderful gold there. All right, so it's very expensive. Verse 14 though, it says, he also made curtains of goat hair for the tent over the tabernacle. He made 11 curtains. Now, they take that beautiful linen with all the angels, and then they cover it with goat hair. All right. And we say that doesn't seem very nice at all. Why in the world would they do that? Well, whenever you would think of goat as an Old Testament believer, you'd probably go over to the scapegoat. And that the idea of the scapegoat, basically once a year on Yom Kippur, they would come in, they would kill one of the goats and sacrifice, and then the priest would lay his hands on the other goat and send it off into the wilderness as a symbol of their sins being released off, and that they were going to find forgiveness here. But oftentimes when you think of the goat, you would think of the sin that it was going to carry. And so here's the picture here now with us. If you're tracking with us, inside this beautiful imagery, the very presence of God, and then right over top of it, you can't hardly see it in this picture, but just imagine it, right over top of it, it was going to be kind of probably a rougher looking goat's hair skin. And the imagery, I think, is this, is that the sin is going to cover us so we can't see the very presence of God. If you were here a few weeks ago, you remember that Moses asked to see the glory of God, and the Lord said, well, I'd have to kill you if I did that because my glory is too great because of the sin that was in Moses's life there. And so this is the imagery that the sin, the goat there, that is the picture of it, is going to cover the glory of God. So in verse 15 now it says, the length of each curtain was 30 cubits, and the breadth of each curtain was 4 cubits. 11 curtains were the same size. And so this is going to be slightly bigger, because how many was in the last one? 10. How many is in this one? 11. So it's going to overlap just a little bit, and so it's going to completely cover everything. So nobody on the outside was going to be able to see inside that tabernacle, because it was going to be completely covered over with sin. Essentially. Verse 16, he coupled 5 curtains by themselves and 6 curtains by themselves. So you had 11, you did 5, you did 6, all right? Some people will say that this is adding man into the 10, the holy 10 commandments, and you add the number of man in there. There's some of the symbolism that you'll find there. But in verse 17, he made 50 loops on the edge of the outermost curtain of the one set, and 50 loops on the edge of the outer, of the other connecting curtain, all right? So there you go. See 50 still connecting all of that. So it's connecting the symbolism of sin over to the connecting of the presence of God there. That 50, the year of Jubilee, the year set free from all of that debt. And he made 50 clasps of bronze to couple it into the tent together, that might be a single whole. Now, notice, what's the difference between these clasps and the previous clasp? Did you catch it? The previous one inside the tabernacle was going to be gold. Now it's going to be bronze. And if you've been paying attention in this series through Exodus, you remember here there's going to be a pretty significant difference. Inside the tabernacle, everything was going to be gold and beautiful and speak to the richness and the purity of God inside of there. On the outside, though, when we look at the altar and the laver, the washing bowl here, it's all going to be bronze. And everything that from the outside perspective is going to be bronze, including these clasps here, which you probably couldn't even see most of them. They were probably going to be covered up by the other tarps as well. But it was all going to be bronze. And now bronze is typically going to reference judgment in the Bible. And you can go through Daniel and Revelations and see that play out even more. But just typically, not in every case, but typically the bronze is going to be a reference of judgment. And so it's so interesting that on the outside, we see the altar, the judgment, the lamb is going to have to die. We see the washing basin that you have to cleanse yourself from all of that impurity. Everything on the outside is going to speak of judgment. But then once you come inside the very presence, that's when you see the gold. Isn't this just fascinating stuff here? Verse 19, and he made for the tent a covering of tanned ram skin and goat skins. And so this was actually going to be another layer on top of that, right? And so that tanned ram skin, rams weren't used a lot inside the tabernacle as compared to some of the other animals. But one time that the ram was going to be used frequently was when there was a new priest that was going to be ordained. They would kill a ram. And so now you see this, that it's kind of speaking to the priesthood, and ultimately it's going to speak to our high priest, and it's going to be tanned, which means it's going to be a reddish color, a deep red. And so it's now almost like the blood of a priest is going to cover up that sin. Can you see that symbolism there? Can you start to catch how beautiful this is? And goat skins there. And he made upright frames. The goat skin is going to be on the top one. There's some debate over what type of skin that was. The ESV says goat skin in that verse. Some other translations might put different ones. We don't know exactly, but basically from the outside, let me go back to verse 19 here. From the outside, it was going to look just like a normal tent, a little bit bigger, but a normal tent. And the Bible actually says that Jesus was just a normal person. If you were to see Jesus just walking down the street, you would not have thought he was Jesus in any sense of the word. He would have looked like a Middle Eastern man 2,000 years ago. So he would have been a little bit shorter, a little bit probably darker skin, a little bit, we can't say for sure how he would have looked here, but you would not have been able to tell. And that's the same picture here, that overall, all of this was just going to be covered up by something that was normal, just like everybody else's tent there. So now in verse 20, it says, then he made the upright frames for the tabernacle of acacia wood. So this is now talking about the inside. If you have a tent, you got to get those tent poles. And for us, it's like connecting all the little plexiglass or plastic poles all together there and trying to bend them all in the right way. Well, they had a very rigid structure. And you'll notice here also, it's going to be made of acacia wood. Now, acacia wood, that was a common type of tree in that day, so it just makes sense that they would use what they had. Interestingly enough, though, acacia wood would actually have very large thorns on them. And it was also very prevalent up in Israel and Jerusalem area. And so many people have speculated, we don't know for sure, but have speculated that this acacia wood might have even been the same type of wood that they used to put the crown on Jesus's head, right? And so all of these things are going to be pointing to Jesus. And that really is the key theme that we're going to be talking about on Sunday, especially, is that every part of this is going to be pointing to Jesus here. So we're talking about just the frame of it here. Verse 21, 10 cubits was the length of a frame, and a cubit and a half the breadth of the frame. Each frame had 2 tenons for fitting together. He did this for all the frames of the tabernacle. The frames, verse 23, the frames for the tabernacle he made thus: 20 frames for the south side. Verse 24, and he made 40 bases of silver under the 20 frames, 2 bases under one frame for its 2 tenons, and 2 bases under the next frame for its 2 tenons here. And so this is once again all talking about really the framing of it, and all of the coverings that we just talked about was going to cover it. So nobody is going to see this, but they would actually take these acacia wood boards and build them in, and then they would dip them in gold. And so even the parts that nobody could see, that it was completely completely covered up was still going to be covered in gold, just as a representative of Jesus Christ and his purity and his beauty there. But notice here, even in that last verse here, verse 24, you'll notice it says he made 40 bases of silver. And so now the bases here, at least for some of them, are going to be not gold, not bronze, but silver. And we say, okay, why silver now? Wasn't gold or bronze? Well, silver is actually going to frequently speak of redemption in the Bible. Redemption in the Bible. And so you know this, because what did Judas get paid whenever he betrayed Jesus? 30 pieces of silver, right? And then we've already talked about in Exodus, how do you redeem a slave? How do you buy back a slave? You have to pay 30 pieces of silver, the same as what we paid for Jesus there. And elsewhere in Zechariah as well, there's stories about that silver is the redemption. Silver is the picture of redemption. So now, not only do you have the bronze on the outside and you have the gold on the inside, but you're also going to have these bases of silver that point to the redemption for which Jesus Christ was going to pay. In verse 25, for the second side of the tabernacle. So this is just talking about the other side here. On the north side, he made 20 frames in the 40 bases of silver, 2 bases under one frame and 2 bases under the next frame. And if you remember, there's a few big numbers here, and the number 40 is also going to be a big one. We remember that because we know, number one, the story of Exodus, right? They're starting out, how long are they going to be in the wilderness? 40 years. And then there's also Jesus. How long did he go into the wilderness? 40 days. How long did Elijah spend out in the wilderness? 40 days. And this is continually over and over and over. Noah's Ark, right? It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. This is typically, the 40 is also going to be a picture of trial from the Lord here, because in a tribulation or a testing period. And so now you start to see this part of it. I think it's just still pointing to the trial and tribulation that Jesus was going to face on our behalf as he was going to buy our redemption as well. Verse 27, for the rear of the tabernacle westward, he made 6 frames. Verse 28, he made 2 frames for the corners of the tabernacle in the rear. This is just talking about the structure. And they were separated beneath, but joined at the top, at the first ring. And he made 2 of them this way for the 2 corners. And some of this is just practical, right? So there needed to be a tent. There needed to be structure. And so we must not be too overly spiritual to say, oh, everything might have had this deep spiritual meaning that's going to change your life. Well, everything's important. Everything should be paid attention to. There is all sorts of symbolism, most of which we probably don't even understand here. But at the same time, let's not go past what Scripture says by ascribing some sort of spiritual value to simply just what could just have been the structure. He's saying, hey, don't let it fall down when the big storm comes, right? So in verse 30 now, it says, there were 8 frames with their bases of silver, 16 bases, under every frame, 2 bases. So all of these bases here, the base for all of this was going to be silver, which points to the redemption here. Verse 31, he made bars of acacia wood, 5 for the frames on the one side of the tabernacle. Verse 32, and 5 bars for the frames of the other side of the tabernacle, and 5 bars for the frames of the tabernacle at the rear westward. And so really he was going to create a cross structure here. So there's going to be upright poles, and then there's also going to be poles going this way. And so it'd be a very sturdy thing. This was not going to be knocked down by anything, any storm or anything like that. Verse 33, and he made up the middle bar to run from end to end halfway up the frames. This was just giving stability to it. Verse 34, and he overlaid the frames with gold and made their rings of gold for holders for the bars and overlaid the bars with gold. So all of this was overlaid with gold, the beauty of it. But here's the crazy thing, guys. They would not see it. Probably nobody would actually even really see this, because it might have been the linen that was going to be on the front facing part. So when you walk in the tabernacle, you might have only seen the linen, and then behind the linen was going to be these beautiful gold frames. And then on the other side, there's going to be the goat skin. And so nobody would even see it, but yet it itself was even covered with gold. It just speaks of the beauty of Christ, that every part of it was just covered in gold here. Verse 35, he made the veil of blue and purple and scarlet yarns and fine twined linen with cherubim skillfully worked into it. He made it. So now this is speaking of, or there's really two veils inside of the tabernacle. There's going to be the veil that separates the Holy of Holies with the holy place, the larger area. And then there was also, and we'll talk more about that in another video here, but then there's going to be another veil that separated the holy area from the outside world. Now the first veil that I mentioned here between the Holy of Holies and the holy area is going to actually have cherubim woven into it. So that's how we know that it's talking about this first one there. But it's in verse 35 here, and it said that, once again, blue and purple and scarlet yarn and fine twine linen and cherubim. So this is going to be the similar theme in all of these things here. And one interesting note that you will start to notice here is that you're going to notice these colors come into play at the outside gate, and then they'll come into play at this first a curtain, and then it will come into play at the second curtain. So it's kind of just leading it into the very presence of God, this pathway here. And notice that there's only one way to get in. You can't come in the back way. There's no other way to jump the fence or anything like that. You got to come in through. And this was going to be the path. These were going to be the colors that were going to mark out that he was going to come and that he's the king here. So in verse 36, and for it, he made 4 pillars of acacia and overlaid them with gold. Their hooks were of gold. And he cast for them 4 bases of silver. And so this was going to be what separates the holy area from the most holy. And there were going to be 4 pillars there with this thick curtain, and nobody could get across it except for the high priest. And we'll talk about that more in a future video as well. But it's going to be this beautiful thing. It's going to be the bases were going to all be silver. Speaking of redemption, the gold there as well for the beauty of Christ. Verse 37, we're almost done. And he also made a screen for the entrance of the tent of blue and purple and scarlet yarns and fine twined linen embroidered with needlework. So now this is now the entrance, not the first tent, the curtain, but the second one here on the outside. There's not going to be any cherubim, but everything else seems to be the same. Verse 37, and its 5 pillars, there's 1 extra pillar. With their hooks, he overlaid their capitals and their fillets with gold, but their 5 bases were of bronze. And so notice here, even in the small little detail, the bases on the inside were silver, speaking of God's redemption. The bases on the outside here holding up these curtains were going to be bronze, speaking of God's judgment. See, because if you are outside of this, if you are outside of all of this, then all you're ever going to see or experience of God is ultimate. But when you come into this place, and we know, and we'll talk about it even more, that as the priest would come into this place and offer the sacrifices, then no longer do you see that bronze judgment, but you start to see his redemption, and you start to see his beauty, and you start to see his glory. And we know as Christians here, that was only ultimately accomplished by the work that our high priest did on the cross, Jesus Christ. And so that's a beautiful story here as well. And so that's what I have for you in Exodus 36. Come back tomorrow on our YouTube channel and we will work through Exodus 37 in a similar way. And then on Sunday, like I said, we're going to do a summary sermon and really just pull out a few of these key themes and really try to apply it to our life today as well. But I hope you have a great rest of the day. I will see you here tomorrow.